The receptionist didn't look at me when she said my name. She glanced past my shoulder, then slid the clipboard back as if it might stain her fingers. The waiting room went quiet in that polite, professional way people get when something uncomfortable happens but no one wants to acknowledge it. A man in a navy suit shifted in his chair. Someone cleared their throat. "Have a seat," she said, already turning away. I dressed carefully for this interview. Pressed blazer, neutral heels, hair pulled back. Respectable. Safe. Still, the HR manager avoided my eyes when he stepped out to call the next candidate. He smiled at everyone else. I sat there longer than necessary, watching applicants come and go, feeling the familiar heat creep up my neck. No explanation. No accusation. Just a silence that carried judgment. By the time the door finally opened for me, I already knew, whatever they'd heard about me had arrived before I did. If you've ever walked into a room and felt judged before you spoke a word, you'll understand this story. I'm Lucy, and for a long time, I believed silence was safer than defending myself. I thought patience would soften people. I was wrong. What happened to me didn't begin with shouting or scenes, it began with whispers that followed me into offices I'd never stepped into before. And one question kept echoing in my head: how do you clear your name when the lie travels faster than you do? I was raised to believe loyalty was a form of love. In our family, obedience passed for respect, and silence was considered maturity. I learned early how to be useful, how to smooth over arguments, remember birthdays, step in when things fell apart. My parents liked to say I was the reliable one. What they meant was that I never pushed back. After college, I did what I was expected to do. I applied for modest roles, stayed close to home, kept my head down. When interviews went well, I shared the news with my parents first. When rejection emails came, I deleted them quietly. I told myself the market was bad. I told myself everyone struggled at first. What I didn't see, what no one bothered to warn me about, was how reputation worked in a small professional circle. Employers talked. References traveled informally. And in our town, my parents' voices carried weight. At family dinners, my father would ask pointed questions about money, about independence, about why I hadn't settled yet. My mother would sigh and remind me that gratitude mattered more than ambition. I nodded, thanked them, cleared the table. Emotional labor was just another chore, one I'd been trained to perform without complaint. So when months turned into years without stable work, I assumed the failure was mine. I adjusted my expectations. I tried harder. I never imagined that behind my back, a different narrative was being carefully, deliberately passed along. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was a pause, too long, on the other end of a phone call. A recruiter I'd spoken with warmly the week before suddenly sounded cautious, careful with her words. "We've decided to move in a different direction," she said. "It's about fit." Fit became the word everyone used. Not qualified. Not experience. Fit. Once, an interviewer asked, almost casually, "You've worked closely with family before, right?" I nodded, confused. He smiled thinly and ended the interview 10 minutes early. Friends stopped recommending me. One admitted, awkwardly, that her manager had heard things and didn't want complications. When I pressed for clarity, she shook her head. "It's not my place, Lucy." At home, my parents grew sharper. My father joked, too loudly, about responsibility. About trust. Once, during an argument about money, he said, "People don't forget who you really are." The room went quiet. My mother didn't correct him. I began replaying conversations in my head, searching for mistakes I couldn't remember making. I checked my emails for misunderstandings, my social media for posts that might be misread. I found nothing. What unsettled me most was how normal everyone acted. No confrontation. No accusation. Just a steady, invisible closing of doors. When I finally asked my father why interviews kept falling through, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Maybe this is how you learn respect." He said it calmly, as if it were advice. That was when I realized something was happening without me, but I still didn't understand how far it had already gone. By the second year, my parents stopped pretending to be concerned. Concern requires empathy. What replaced it was certainty. My father spoke about my unemployment as if it were a settled fact, a flaw in my character rather than a circumstance. At some point, he said at dinner one night, "Employers figure out who they can trust." I noticed how relaxed he seemed when he said it. confident, as if he knew something I didn't. Family gatherings became quieter for me. Conversations shifted when I entered the room. An aunt once mentioned, too quickly, that she'd heard I was between things again. My cousin avoided eye contact. No one asked questions. Whatever story they'd been told was easier to accept than the alternative. Publicly, my parents were generous. They paid for groceries once in a while, mentioned helping Lucy get back on her feet. Privately, they reminded me that dependence had consequences. My father liked to end arguments with the same sentence, "Respect is earned." The contrast was sharpest outside the house. I'd smile through interviews, present my portfolio, answer carefully. Recruiters nodded, until something shifted. A look. A hesitation. Once, a hiring manager asked outright, "Is there anything in your past we should know before moving forward?" The question wasn't hostile. It was cautious. Defensive. I walked home that day with a growing certainty. This wasn't coincidence. This was coordinated. Still, I said nothing. I had no proof, only patterns. And patterns are easy to dismiss when the people creating them speak with authority. So I stayed quiet, watched, listened. My silence was mistaken for submission, and that mistake made them bolder. Silence has a way of turning inward. Without answers, I began to inventory myself, every choice, every argument, every small rebellion I might have mistaken for independence. I wondered if I'd said something careless to the wrong person, if a joke had landed wrong, if confidence had once looked like arrogance. Gaslighting doesn't always arrive as denial. Sometimes it arrives as doubt you willingly carry. Days blurred into routines meant to look productive. I revised my resume for the 100th time. I practiced interview answers out loud. I woke early, dressed professionally, and returned home by afternoon with nothing new to report. When neighbors asked how the job search was going, I smiled and said, "Still trying." Inside the house, my parents watched this quietly. My mother offered practical advice, courses I could take, connections I could rebuild, each suggestion carrying the unspoken assumption that I was the problem to be fixed. My father said less, but when he did, it landed heavy. "People talk," he reminded me once. "Reputations stick." I stopped defending myself because I no longer knew what I was defending against. Accusations you can't hear are impossible to answer. So I focused on dignity. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't collapse. I kept my voice steady and my movements small, as if composure alone could shield me. At night, doubt crept in anyway. I lay awake wondering if respect really was something I'd failed to earn. If the silence around me was proof. If waiting quietly was maturity, or fear dressed up as patience. What I didn't realize then was that my endurance was being observed. Not by my parents. By someone else entirely. It finally happened. The blow that made me feel truly finished, at least, that's how it appeared. I had secured an interview at a company I admired, a place where my skills and effort could finally matter. I spent days preparing, rehearsing answers, imagining the moment I could finally prove myself. My confidence returned cautiously, like a candle flickering in a draft. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a small hope. Then, the call came. Not rejection. Not even a polite delay. Just silence, weeks of it, followed by a single line from HR, "We've decided to move forward with another candidate." No explanation. No feedback. No reason. Just the word "another." It stung far more than I expected. For 2 years, every opportunity had vanished, but each loss was scattered, isolated. This one felt deliberate. Total. Complete. I felt the weight of my parents' unseen influence pressing down. Their quiet campaign, their whispers to every employer I'd ever trusted, had culminated in this apparent failure. I told myself it was the end. That my path had been blocked permanently. That any future hope was pointless. Even friends who tried to console me seemed powerless. Their words bounced off a barrier I could not touch. At home, my parents watched carefully, almost satisfied, as though they had proven a point. My father remarked casually, "Maybe now you understand why we gave advice." My mother nodded. Some lessons are harsh but necessary. Their tone carried no accusation, no cruelty, it was calm. Dismissal as education. In that moment, the world felt as though it had shrunk around me. I was boxed in by silence, suspicion, and loss. It seemed everyone agreed I was defeated. Even I began to believe it. Yet beneath that weight, I was observing. Recording. Not for confrontation, but for understanding. Patterns have a rhythm. And every rhythm has a weak point. I didn't collapse. Not then. Not ever. Instead, I made quiet notes. Times, dates, conversations. Every employer's response, every subtle hesitation, every phrase my parents had used when advising me. I documented without accusation, without confrontation, without letting anyone know I was paying attention. Patience became a shield, observation, a weapon I wasn't yet ready to wield. At night, I reviewed the patterns. Every door that had closed, every opportunity diverted, it all began to trace a line back to them. Not only my parents, but the network they had quietly influenced, the connections I never suspected. What had seemed like random failures now revealed a carefully orchestrated design. Even in solitude, I held my composure. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of anyone. I maintained appearances, smiled, answered politely. My silence was misinterpreted as weakness. And that misinterpretation was their mistake. I realized then that endurance isn't passive. It's active, quiet, and calculated. It allows you to see clearly, to gather information, to understand where you are vulnerable and where you hold the upper hand. The world outside believed I was struggling. Inside, I was planning. And in planning, I found a small, steady hope. Not of revenge. Not yet. But of inevitable justice. The next chapter would require awareness, clarity, and timing. Weeks of careful observation finally began to pay off. I started to notice the repetition, the same hesitant phrasing from recruiters, the same vague warnings from acquaintances, the subtle nods and glances my parents exchanged when my name came up. What had once felt like random misfortune now revealed itself as deliberate action. Every pattern, every inconsistency, every pause in conversation told a story I had been too trusting to see before. I realized that my parents weren't just controlling their narrative, they were weaponizing it. They had convinced employers, neighbors, and even some friends that I was untrustworthy. Yet, the very meticulousness of their efforts was their weakness. Patterns are predictable. Repetition is traceable. And they had left a trail for anyone careful enough to notice. It was a revelation that brought clarity. No longer was I simply the victim. I became the observer. I began to map connections, document conversations, and keep meticulous notes. Every hint, every sliver of truth I gathered became leverage. Not yet for confrontation, but for control. For the first time in years, I felt the shift. Awareness alone was powerful. I no longer had to argue, plead, or justify myself. I could wait. I could record. I could prepare. And in that preparation, I began to feel a quiet confidence rise, subtle but unshakable. The game was no longer just about enduring. It was about understanding. And understanding was power. While everyone assumed I was defeated, I quietly amassed evidence no one suspected I had. I reviewed every interview rejection, noting the dates, the wording, the tone. I traced phone calls, recorded discrepancies in what my parents had told friends versus what actually happened. Every coincidental job loss became a documented moment. What made this advantage hidden was its invisibility. My parents believed my silence was submission. Recruiters assumed I was unaware. Even friends thought I was quietly enduring misfortune. But behind the calm exterior, I was building a timeline. Every subtle manipulation, every rumor spread, every misrepresentation, all recorded, all cross-checked, all ready. I also sought witnesses, subtly. Former colleagues who had overheard whispers, neighbors who had noticed suspicious behavior, even casual acquaintances who had been approached by my parents. None suspected that I was connecting dots, turning fragments of information into an airtight record. And then there was my grandmother. Though she had passed years ago, she had left instructions, letters, and notarized documents intended to protect me if my parents' actions ever crossed a line. I had kept them tucked away, almost forgotten, until now. Every document was validated, every letter legally binding. The combination of personal evidence and my grandmother's foresight created a hidden arsenal. This wasn't about revenge yet. This was about readiness, about ensuring that when the moment arrived, it would be unassailable. The world thought I was powerless. That illusion would be shattered. Because sometimes the most devastating power is invisible until deployed. As I reviewed the patterns and evidence, something inside me shifted. The fear, the self-doubt, the constant need for validation, all of it began to fade. I stopped measuring my worth by their words or by the closed doors around me. Instead, I focused on clarity, patience, and strategy. I realized that seeking approval had always weakened me. Every apology I had offered, every attempt to explain myself, had been ignored or twisted. Now, I needed no one's validation. My confidence was quiet, steady, unshakable. It was not loud or performative, it was deliberate. I began to envision the steps ahead, knowing that timing would matter more than haste. Every piece of evidence, every documented conversation, every notarized letter from my grandmother became part of a careful plan. I wasn't acting impulsively. I was preparing for a moment when truth, law, and social awareness would converge. In that internal transformation, I felt liberation. Not revenge, yet, but clarity. My actions would be precise, calculated, and undeniable. I had endured humiliation, confusion, and isolation. Now, awareness had given me a perspective no one else held. The calm I felt was not passive. It was active, intentional, and strong. I was no longer a participant in their narrative. I was the architect of the outcome. And in that quiet, I began to feel the first hint of inevitable justice, a justice that would arrive not through anger, but through meticulous planning and timing. I approached each day with a methodical purpose. Every interaction, every call, every meeting was noted, assessed, and placed into a timeline. I made no rash decisions. Impulse had never helped me, careful calculation would. I revisited my grandmother's letters and documents, ensuring everything was complete, organized, and legally sound. Every statement, every notarized record, every witness note became part of a comprehensive plan. Nothing was left to chance. At the same time, I maintained appearances. At home, I smiled, helped, and remained polite, giving no hint of the storm I was quietly orchestrating. At work, in the rare interviews I secured, I presented myself professionally, calm, and composed. The world saw only patience, unaware of the strategy unfolding behind it. I mapped the influence of my parents, tracing connections to every employer, friend, and acquaintance they had contacted. Patterns of misinformation and bias became predictable. I pinpointed the weak points, the places where a well-timed revelation could undo their efforts completely. Preparation also meant psychological readiness. I practiced restraint, ensuring that when the moment came, my actions would be precise, unassailable, and quietly devastating. The plan wasn't revenge for humiliation, it was justice for years of manipulation, lies, and suffering. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. I had patience on my side, and patience is stronger than anger. Every small step, every observation, every documented detail was part of a greater design. The next time they believed they had control, they would be proven wrong in a way no one could dispute. I had endured, observed, and transformed. Now I was ready to act, with timing, leverage, and undeniable authority. The interview invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning. Same town. Same professional circle. A company my parents knew well. I accepted without hesitation. Walking into that building felt familiar, not because I'd been there before, but because it carried the same quiet judgment I'd learned to recognize. The polished floors, the muted conversations, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. This was the arena where my reputation had been quietly dismantled. I wore the same calm I'd practiced for months. Neutral blazer. Hair neatly pulled back. Nothing dramatic. Nothing defensive. I didn't need armor anymore. When I was shown into the conference room, I noticed the framed photos on the wall, community events, charity dinners, familiar faces. My parents had attended some of those. They always made sure to be seen in the right places. I sat down, placed my folder on the table, and waited. The door opened. The CEO walked in, older than I expected, composed, carrying authority without effort. He looked at me for a long moment, not assessing my resume, not my posture, but my face. Recognition flickered, then something else, curiosity. "Lucy," he said, sitting across from me. "Before we begin, there's something I need to give you." He reached into his briefcase and placed a thick, sealed envelope on the table between us. "Your grandmother left this with me," he continued calmly. 15 years ago. With strict instructions about when it was to be opened. My hands remained still. My expression didn't change. Inside, everything aligned. The date stamped across the envelope was unmistakable. 15 years ago. The same year my parents' version of me had quietly begun. My parents thought they had complete control. They had spread lies, manipulated perceptions, and convinced the town, and even professional circles, that I was untrustworthy. They believed my silence was submission, that my composure was weakness. They had miscalculated. As I held the envelope, I realized the extent of their overconfidence. Their arrogance had left them blind to the one person who had quietly observed, documented, and prepared me. Every call they made to employers, every casual remark at social gatherings, every subtle suggestion to friends and neighbors, they had woven a web they didn't know I had mapped in detail. They had assumed that the pattern of their influence would remain invisible. They had assumed that no one would notice the careful trail of documentation my grandmother had left, each notarized letter, each witness account, each recorded moment of manipulation. They were about to learn the truth, and it would hit harder than any confrontation they could imagine. While they were basking in their perceived victory, I prepared silently. I reviewed every document, every detail, ensuring that when the moment came, the revelation would be irrefutable. My parents' overreach had created an opening. Their hubris was a weakness waiting to be exploited legally, socially, and publicly. No one suspected the calm in me was not resignation but strategy. The same arrogance they had displayed in orchestrating my downfall would be mirrored in their exposure. They believed the story they had created was final, permanent, and untouchable. They could not have been more wrong. Timing was everything. I had waited patiently, endured humiliation, observed their tactics, and now held the key to dismantle the illusion they had built. And the power of restraint ensured that when justice struck, it would be unassailable, undeniable, and irreversible. Their overconfidence would be their undoing. I opened the envelope carefully, deliberately. The contents were meticulous: letters, notarized documents, witness statements, and records dating back 15 years. My grandmother had foreseen the possibility of my parents' manipulation and had prepared everything to protect me. The CEO leaned forward. These documents are legally binding. Every statement, every record has been verified. You are in the clear, and your parents' actions are now fully documented. For the first time in years, I saw the full scope of what had been done to me. Employers, friends, neighbors, all had been influenced by a narrative constructed to ruin my reputation. And for the first time, I held the power to correct it. I handed a copy of the documents to the legal department present in the room. "Please proceed as instructed by my grandmother," I said calmly. My voice betrayed nothing. No anger, no triumph, just measured authority. Within moments, notices began to be sent, cease and desist letters, corrections to prior employers, and formal warnings outlining the legal consequences of spreading false information. Every misrepresentation, every deliberate attempt to tarnish my reputation, was now backed by law. The CEO looked at me. "Your patience, discretion, and documentation have created an unassailable case. They will realize their overreach soon enough." I nodded. I didn't need to gloat. The law, facts, and timing would do the work I had endured years to prepare for. And then, quietly, I allowed myself to feel the weight lift. I had not acted rashly. I had not sought revenge for humiliation. I had acted with precision, restraint, and strategy. And in doing so, I had ensured that justice would be inescapable, irreversible, and devastatingly clear. The room was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers. The calm in my demeanor spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. My parents' lies were unraveling, not by my fury, but by truth, patience, and meticulous planning. For the first time in 15 years, I felt untouchable, not because I had power over others, but because I had power over the situation, over timing, and over the narrative itself. Within days, the impact of the documents and legal notices became visible. Employers who had once dismissed me now reached out with apologies, acknowledging the misinformation spread by my parents. Friends who had distanced themselves began to reconnect, often with hesitant words, realizing the truth had finally come to light. At home, the shift was undeniable. My father's smug confidence evaporated. He spoke less, measured every word, and avoided eye contact. My mother, usually composed, faltered when casual remarks from neighbors or acquaintances exposed her previous attempts to manipulate perceptions. The social network my parents had relied upon for influence began to collapse. Invitations were rescinded, casual gossip stopped, and those who had once believed their narrative now questioned it. The townspeople, once silent witnesses, now aligned quietly with the facts that had been presented. I observed all of it calmly. I did not gloat. I did not speak harshly. The collapse occurred on its own, driven by evidence, law, and careful preparation. The humiliation my parents had orchestrated for me was mirrored back, not through malice, but through truth and patience. Even in moments where I could feel triumph rising, I remained composed. The fall of their social authority was complete, yet subtle. There was no spectacle, no public shaming, only the unmistakable realization among everyone involved that the narrative had shifted irrevocably. I realized then that the most effective power is invisible. It doesn't scream. It doesn't strike. It waits. It observes. And when it moves, it does so with precision that no one can resist. By the end, my parents' influence over my reputation was gone. Every lie they had told had been undone, not by confrontation, but by quiet, calculated truth. The balance of control, once entirely theirs, had shifted, silently, legally, and irrevocably. The days that followed were quiet but profoundly transformative. Employers corrected records, offers arrived without hesitation, and colleagues began treating me with the respect I had been denied for years. The social landscape shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. At home, my parents were careful with their words, cautious in their actions, and subdued in their presence. They no longer commanded the unquestioned authority they had once wielded. The power dynamic had shifted quietly but irreversibly. I kept my interactions calm, measured, and deliberate. There was no need for confrontation, no need for anger. Their fall had occurred through law, documentation, and patience, tools far stronger than rash emotion. Friends and acquaintances who had doubted me began to approach cautiously, seeking clarity, offering apologies, or simply observing from a distance. Their responses reaffirmed what I had learned over the years: quiet, strategic endurance builds credibility faster than force or fury ever could. For the first time, I felt truly free. Not just from the lies and manipulations, but from the anxiety and fear that had governed my life for so long. Control, once stolen from me, was restored, legally, socially, and emotionally. The world had shifted around me, yet I remained composed, my dignity intact. Justice had been served not through spectacle, but through meticulous preparation, observation, and restraint. I learned that dignity, patience, and strategy can be more powerful than anger or confrontation. Endurance is not weakness, it is preparation. Observing quietly, documenting meticulously, and waiting for the right moment allowed me to reclaim what had been stolen from me: my reputation, my opportunities, and my confidence. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it moves silently, unassailable, and irreversible. My parents' attempts to control my life backfired not because I sought revenge, but because I relied on truth, evidence, and timing. Every misrepresentation, every lie, every subtle manipulation was dismantled by facts I had patiently gathered and preserved. I emerged from years of humiliation not embittered, but composed. I discovered that true power lies in restraint, clarity, and preparedness. By the time the world realized what had been done, the consequences were inevitable, and no one could dispute them. I am Lucy, and my story is proof that patience, courage, and foresight can transform suffering into undeniable justice. Endurance, when paired with strategy, ensures that dignity always prevails.